Tonight, the families who is suing the federal government because their daughter was killed by an illegal immigrant who had been deported. Now, can they sue Uncle Sam? And if so, do they have any chance of winning? Then, remember when Edward Snowden exposed the extent of the government's spying powers on ordinary Americans? Well, there was a huge push to rein in the NSA. Remember that? Well, Congress tried it, the courts tried it, but the NSA, they're still at it. Also, taking a stand against Stand Your Ground. Should that gun law stay on the books? We're going to tell you about a case in Tennessee that's causing a whole lot more people to question it even more. Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And we begin this evening with an explosive case coming out of San Francisco that I'm sure many of you have heard of, and it has national implications. The family of Kate Steinle, they are suing federal agencies as well as a local sheriff. Now, Kate, she was killed while walking on a San Francisco pier in July. Police say an illegal immigrant named Juan Francisco Sanchez admitted to killing her. Sanchez had been deported several times, but was released from a San Francisco jail earlier this year despite a federal request to hold him until immigration could pick him up. Now, this case is shining a spotlight on sanctuary cities, an expression many of us heard of for the first time after this case. And these sanctuary cities are places that refuse to enforce federal immigration laws. The victim's brother explains why the family is blaming the government for what happened to their loved one.
We're here to make sure that a change is made so nobody has to endure the pain that my mom and dad and I go through on a daily basis because the system failed our sister.
Now, I think we can all agree that a tragedy happened to that poor young girl here. The question, though, is, and there's many, where does the blame lie? If you believe that it was the government or multiple agencies or even the mayor's office or even the sheriff's office, can you sue the government? And where can culpability start and stop? And due process for all, what does that mean? We're getting into all those questions and more with our panel. Let's bring them in now. Jim Kasuris, he's a criminal defense attorney in Manhattan. He sits on the board of directors of, among other places, the New York City Criminal Bar Association, and he frequently lectures at New York Law School, bar associations in Queens, New York City, as well as abroad. Doug Von Oist, a founding partner of Carson Von Oist, focusing on corporate misconduct, and he was selected by the Legal 500 as one of the most influential trial lawyers in the entire country. And Mayo Bartlett, he's an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLLC, and he's former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at Westchester County DA's office, and he's been a vocal face and voice here as relates to major civil rights issues that have come up recently as well. Gentlemen, thank you all as always. Okay. Like I said, we all agree what happened in San Francisco is tragic, and it seems to be that it should have been preventable. This case raises a whole host of issues. Let me just get to the first one. Even if we deem the behavior or the ineptitude of the sheriff's office, of the city itself of San Francisco, of the federal government and the agencies that either weren't cooperating or communicating properly, can one sue the government, federal or state?
You can sue the government. The question is whether there's a lawsuit in this case. And I have to say, I don't know that this is a sanctuary city case. My understanding of the facts, correct me if I'm wrong, is when the sheriff was about to release this guy, they called the feds and asked, is he done with his time? Do you want him for anything? Are there any outstanding warrants? He did the right thing. And I'm not so sure that he wouldn't have abided by any instructions to hold him. What he was told was, he served his time, we have no warrants, but ICE might want him for deportation. And the sheriff said, is there a warrant? And the answer was no. And they never went and got a warrant. So the issue is, are you going to blame the sheriff for releasing a guy when he has no warrant, but all he's got is somebody on the other end saying, could you hold him? So I don't know that the sheriff did anything wrong here, and I don't know that he would have refused to have held him, at least for a certain period of time, if there isn't a warrant. The same issue has come up in New York, Rich, where people at Rikers would be done with their time, and they would check for warrants. And every once in a while, somebody at ICE would say, hold him, but they'd never come to pick him up. And so Rikers basically said, and the city said, look, we'll hold the guy for you, But you have to have a warrant. You have to lodge a warrant. It doesn't take anything. So I don't know that this is a situation where they would have refused to hold him.
Doug, beyond the sanctuary city, that phrase that many of us have heard of, and I think depending on the outlet, that's the whole crux of the case. Maybe it's not just stovepiping where folks aren't communicating properly or not having in front of them what they need to when they communicate, is also due process for all. I think most of us understand what due process is. But the last part of it, for all, and whether or not that extends to somebody of an illegal status, is there clarity here? Because a lot of people say that's the crux of this issue.
Well, people whose status is questioned in this country can bring lawsuits. There's no doubt about that. But you know, when you're looking at this in the context of a lawsuit, there can be moral blame, there can be blame of the agencies, they did things wrong, but you still have to look at the lawsuit in the context of, was it foreseeable that this man would, if he was released, you know, or let go improperly, would he end up and actually murder this woman?
But couldn't you say, especially if you're the family, and I know people too close to it aren't always but put yourself in the Steinle family. This is a guy with a rap sheet that's really long here. He shouldn't have been in the country to begin with, and I'm not trying to get in a whole debate about immigration and what our policy should or shouldn't be, but there's a compelling argument that maybe, you know, he wasn't a loaded gun, but he certainly was someone we didn't want walking the streets of New York. And the questions were raised as to whether or not he should be walking the streets of San Francisco. And there was a miscommunication and he was released. If they have a compelling case against anybody, who would it be?
Well, I mean, I think they definitely have a case against him, the person that...
But I'm talking about an agency, whether it be the feds or whether it be the city or who.
The problem is that sometimes people do things wrong and there's still not a lawsuit, and that's difficult for families, especially like the family that we just saw that's obviously in a lot of pain. Sometimes people do things wrong, but you can't sue them. Remember, you're suing for money in a case like this. That's what you're suing for. You're not really suing for an agency to punish them. So
you heard the brother, though, say from a policy standpoint, he'd want this to be the impetus for a change. And Mayo, that's a perfect entree to you, because how many times have we talked about on this program that depending on where you live in the country, there's different rules about getting guns, different rules on how to use guns. We'll talk about that later on in the program at Stand Your Ground. Different rules as relates to drugs, marijuana, the legality or the enforcement or lack thereof in places like Washington or Colorado, abortion, access to clinics or whatever else. It seems to me that if you were walking on a pier, let's say, in Florida, contrasting to walking on a pier in San Francisco, regardless of how we feel our immigration policy should or shouldn't be, they'd be two different sets of rules as to whether or not Mr. Sanchez would have been walking on that same pier that day. Are we getting to a point in this country where we have such a hodgepodge that depending on the zip code you live in, you're going to get different treatment in the eyes of the law?
I was just going to say that. It's more than whether you're in San Francisco or Florida. It depends on what town you're in. You could be in Westchester County, Putnam, Dutchess, and if you're in one town versus another, you could have a very different result. So you may have a particular town where you may get stopped and frisked within New York City, in particular neighborhoods, but not others. That's in one city and one police department. I think the big question here really is, did the police do their due diligence? It seems as if they did in this case. It seems as if they did reach out to the federal government and asked if there's any reason to hold this person. And by asking that, it gives the impression that if they said yes, they probably would have held him. But even then, there still is due process for him, even though he's not a United States citizen.
But from within.
Absolutely,
but
from within. And that means that doesn't mean we can simply violate his rights. However, the question I would have is, did the federal government act in due diligence, and did they act upon the fact that he's there? So if you're made aware that he's there, whether it's the federal government or a police agency that has a warrant and they simply choose not to come, it's not realistic to expect the holding agency to keep him for that forever, because at that point you start to open yourself up to liability because someone says, well, why are you holding this person? There's no basis.
No change is needed, Rich. No change is needed. It's really simple. He was in federal custody. He was brought to San Francisco to answer charges. Put a hold on him. If the system put a hold on him, they can't release
Doug,
him.
you used to work for the DA's office when you were in Long Island. I remember not that many years ago, in fact, friend of the program, County Executive Steve Levy at the time. I disagreed with him then. I said as much. I didn't like the idea in Suffolk where people basically had the PD acting like ICE agents, kicking down doors at people in the dead of night, okay? But you go over to Nassau, there's a whole different set of rules. So literally, at the border between Nassau and Suffolk, you have different immigration laws in this country. It just seems crazy to me that that's the right way, especially when you're talking about immigration that has nothing to do with it's where they're coming from. It's about a national issue as to what they have in terms of criminal records. Are they a threat to society? Should they not be deported? Whatever the case may be. It just seems so haphazard now. And if you want a crystallization of states' rights or county rights or city rights gone wrong, the idea of having different immigration laws in this country depending on what your zip code is sounds nuts to me.
Well, they're not different immigration laws. There's different
immigration enforcement.
Right. Listen, that's what we have. I mean, that's what this country is. We elect officials in localities to do what the people in that locality want them to do. And if they don't do it, they're thrown out. Laws are always prosecuted in different ways throughout the country. The DWI policy, the driving while intoxicated policy, is a great example. You'll be if you drive through one county, you're treated one way. You drive through another county, you're treated another way. It just reflects the people in that community.
It's interesting. All right. A subject we've talked about quite a bit here around the table is Big Brother. And in a post 9/11 America, that trade-off between privacy and protection, well, the issue is front and center yet again. A federal court just reversed a ban on the NSA's vast bulk collection authority. And if you're saying, I thought they did it before, don't feel bad. We're all confused. This thing keeps changing seemingly by the week, if not the month. So even though it's previously been ruled unconstitutional, the NSA can still do it. The table will discuss why this should matter to everybody, even if you at home are saying, enough already. I don't care. It sounds like Deflategate. Let's move on. Stay with us. We'll get into that.